Shabbat Shalom. There's a story about the 60s rock band The Doors and their lead singer, Jim Morrison. They were invited to New York City to play the Ed Sullivan Show in 1967. And arguably, this was the most watched show in America at the time. Every important songwriter would perform on his show before millions of Americans. It's a very important network show. And doing so was a sign that you had officially made it as an artist. Now, in 1967, The Doors' hit single, Light My Fire, was currently #1 on the Billboard charts, so naturally, they were invited to perform their song on the very popular Ed Sullivan television show. Keyboardist of The Doors, Ray Manzarek, recounted years later that while the band was backstage in the dressing room preparing for their performance, a representative from the network television came in and told them, "Gentlemen, we have a big problem." And puzzled, the band asked what the issue was. And it turns out one of the lyrics in the song was, quote, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher." This was a big issue in 1967. You know that it would be untrue. You know that I would be a liar if I was to say to you, "Girl, we couldn't." You can't say it on Ed Sullivan. You can't say it in shul, I guess. Anyway, got a lot of 60s folks in here, I guess. It turns out that while this was 1967, Ed Sullivan had some strict ground rules, and he told them that Elvis couldn't shake his pelvis, the Rolling Stones weren't allowed to use the words "spend the night," and any possible references to drugs or alcohol were forbidden on Ed's show. But the network TV guy had come up with a suggestion. He says, "Fellas, why don't we change the lyrics to, 'Girl, we couldn't get much better'?" The band sat there dumbfounded. Change their lyrics? Their musical integrity? Reluctantly, the band agreed and went on stage to perform. And as they played their song, the moment of truth came. "If I was to say to you," Morrison sang, everybody waited. "Girl, we couldn't get much higher." He had done it. The rest of the band smirked and continued the song, and when they finally went backstage, they were accosted by the same network representative who was going berserk. "You said it! How dare you!" he screamed at them. "You'll never play the Ed Sullivan Show again." There was a pause, and in true Jim Morrison fashion, the singer responded, "Hey man, we just played the Ed Sullivan Show." The Doors would go on to sell 100 million records worldwide and eventually have their own biopic film in 1991, and they'd later be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, making Rolling Stone's list of the greatest American rock bands ever. All of this, despite only playing the Ed Sullivan Show once. Not too shabby. Today, I want to talk about breaking the rules, maybe even breaking the law, maybe even breaking Jewish law. This is a really interesting phenomenon that rabbis get to experience. And let me just say from the get-go, maybe I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to. It's not such a big deal to us. Like if I'm out at a restaurant and I run into a congregant or even just a Jewish person that I know, and they're eating something not kosher. Okay, this happens sometimes. And sometimes it's blatantly not kosher. If I'm just around, they tend to get very, very embarrassed because the rabbi saw them eat treif. Now, you should know that the real reason I feel bad about this encounter is because they feel really bad. And just my being around them makes them feel bad. And more often than not, in this very awkward interaction, they'll say something like, "I'm sorry, Rabbi, I'm a bad Jew. I'm a bad Jew." I hear this a lot. And when I hear people come into my office, they say this, they try to ease their pain. "I'm a bad Jew." Sometimes I hear this on airplanes when people ask what I do, and I'm a moron, so I tell them I'm a rabbi. And they respond nervously, well, I'm a bad Jew. And I've got to say, I just need to say this out loud, I doubt that you're really a bad Jew. Jeffrey Epstein was a bad Jew. Jared from Subway, bad Jew. David Berkowitz, son of Sam Killer. Those are bad Jews. Having a shrimp cocktail when your rabbi is around, I don't think that makes you a bad Jew. Maybe it makes you a nervous Jew. I don't think it makes you a bad Jew. By no coincidence, I want to link these ideas to the Parsha for the week Behar. And I'll start with the Parsha from next week, Behukotai. God gives us a list of curses that God will afflict us with if we break Torah law, and most of them are found in Vayikra chapter 26. They're genuinely horrifying if you read them. God promises to harm us and destroy us in every imaginable way. In one awful instance, declaring that if we violate halakha, this is next week's Parsha, he says we will be forced to eat our own children. Ugh. Now, as traumatic as that Parsha is, the one immediately before it, this one, Behar, is traumatically boring in my opinion. It outlaws the procedures for the Shemitah or the sabbatical year that's to take place every 7 years. And this is also talked about in Devarim chapter 15. And I can tell you with genuine honesty that even with all of my rabbinic training, this Parsha this week is difficult to comprehend. And overall, I think it's kind of confusing because the laws and customs of Shemitah are controversial and, in my opinion, overwhelming. And what is more problematic about them is, in fact, that they probably didn't work. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, within the laws of the Shemitah, the sabbatical year, is the idea that there would be a universal cancellation of all debts every 7 years. Now, imagine doing that now in 2024, just canceling all of the debt. Mortgages, credit cards, car loans, all gone after 7 years. Some of you are smiling. You like this idea. It sounds fantastic, but financially, it could never work. The Torah meant well for advocating for this idea. It was designed to protect the poor and the disadvantaged, affording them a chance to escape a life of eternal debt. The practical problem with this, of course, is that if you are the one lending the money, you're not going to want to lend money to anyone if legally their debt that you gave them would be canceled in just a number of years. And the Torah is aware of this. It addresses this specific point. It says in Deuteronomy 15:9, quote, "Be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. Do not think the Shemitah year, the year for canceling debts, is coming, so that you do not show ill will toward the needy among you, your fellow Israelites, and you refuse to lend to them. They may then appeal to Adonai against you, and you will be found guilty of sin." So the Torah knew that this would happen, and it did. We know historically that people stopped lending money, so much so that the Israelites of the later Second Temple period were on the verge of an economic collapse because of this. Then came along Rabbi Hillel the Elder, and he recognized that this specific Torah law was wrecking the finances of companies and individuals, and if his people were to ever thrive, then they couldn't do it with this particular law on the books. Now, being the leader and the sage that Hillel was, he knew that he could not just totally overrule this law, deoraita. He could not declare it obsolete and just continue from there. He knew he couldn't do that. He didn't want to break the rules. He didn't want to break Jewish law, so he did something interesting. He decided to work through them. He issued what in rabbinics we call a prosbul, which is the Greek word for delivery. And basically, this decree changed the status of individual private loans by turning them into public administration. The Torah's law of abolishing debt did not apply to loans within the public domain, so technically, while interesting and controversial, this was still kosher. This allowed the poor to receive interest-free loans before the Shemitah year while protecting the investments of all the lenders. Perhaps there is something to be learned of Rabbi Hillel and also Jim Morrison. Morrison, of course, died at the age 27 from an apparent overdose. It seems that pushing the limits of the rules too often and breaking the rules too often can lead to a tragic end. But Hillel, the elder, on the other hand, would go on to establish the Mishnah, be the founder of the Hillel house, and train many, many disciples and teachers. I think the main difference between these two men, and obviously I recognize that there are many, but for purposes of argument, the big difference that I see was that Hillel respected the law that he was bending. He saw Torah as authoritative. He played by the rules even if at the end he would say, or some would say, that he broke them. Well, I don't necessarily think that God inflicts curses on us if we break Torah law. I do think that there are blessings associated with keeping these mitzvot. And I think also that there is an added spiritual benefit of working through commandments you might not feel a connection with. Jewish tradition teaches that one can argue with God. That's ultimately what the rabbinic system becomes. But you should only do this. You should only do this only if you respect the law you intend to bend. So today, friends, I invite you to argue with God. Perhaps argue with yourself, or even to argue with me nicely. What mitzvah could you explore further? Which ones resonate with you and which ones don't? Which one lights your fire? Even if you end up disagreeing with them, I think the process of navigating them is what's most important. Also, I'd advise you not to dwell on the mitzvot that make you feel bad, make you feel like a bad Jew. Rather, focus on what inspires you to live a meaningful Jewish life. Maybe that's lighting candles on Friday night, wearing your grandfather's talis, or celebrating a really wonderful bar or bat mitzvah. The beautiful thing about our tradition is that every day we have the opportunity to explore new ways to practice. We're never too old to observe, to engage, or even to argue. To conclude, I'll say again that you're not a bad Jew if you break the rules, but I'd rather you break on through to the other side. Shabbat Shalom.